Love Suicide at Toribeyama. Adapted from Okamoto Kidō's Toribeyama Shinju, 1911. Two figures walk a hillside road in the moonlight. It's the dead of night, but they're dressed for a festival. Bright silk, the kind you'd save for New Year's morning. Not funeral clothes, not by design anyway. They're headed for a place called Toribeyama. In 17th century Kyoto, everyone knew what that hill was for. It was where you took the dead to burn them. These two are still breathing. For now. One of them is a samurai, a guest of the Shogun himself, a man who by every account had nothing to apologize for and nowhere he needed to be tonight except exactly where duty told him to be. The other is a girl who, 1 month earlier, didn't even know his name. To understand how a decorated retainer and a 17-year-old courtesan ended up walking hand in hand toward a burial ground under a full moon, you have to go back to the night she was terrified of him. Back to a debut she didn't want in a business she never chose, on an evening she spent crying into a railing because she was too afraid to go back inside. That's where this starts. Chapter 1. The first night. Autumn insects were dying in the drainage ditch behind the tea house, and their song had gone thin and cracked. Osome, 17 years old and about to work her first night as a courtesan, found the sound unbearably sad. She wasn't supposed to be out here. She was supposed to be in the banquet room, entertaining guests, smiling, but she'd slipped away to the corridor railing instead because the alternative was sitting under bright lanterns, pretending she wasn't shaking. Tonight's guests made it worse. They were samurai from Edo, retainers accompanying the new Shogun Iemitsu on his state visit to the capital. Kyoto that season was flooded with them. Wherever the Shogun's household went, thousands of armed men went too, and when they weren't on formal duty, a great many of them went looking for wine and women. The old licensed quarter at Yanagimachi had lost business to unlicensed districts like Gion, where Osome had just been sold into service at a house called Wakamatsuya. Her owner had drilled one thing into her before tonight. These are Edo men. Be careful. Don't embarrass the house. That warning did nothing but multiply her fear. She had no idea how to behave in front of important strangers. She only knew that failing was not an option she'd been given, so she'd run from the light out to this railing to listen to dying insects and cry where no one could see. "What are you crying about?" She hadn't heard him approach. A man was standing behind her, one of tonight's guests, she realized, judging by the blunt Edo accent that cut through the dark. She could barely make out his face. "Tell me," he said, not unkindly. "If something's wrong, I can help." She said nothing. He tried again, gentler this time. Asked her name, asked if tonight's crowd included anyone she already knew. When she admitted this was her very first night in the business, something in his voice changed. "Ah, that's why you're crying," he exhaled. "Fine, I'll cover your fee myself. Go home." It was on paper an act of enormous kindness, and completely useless to her. I guess simply paying to send a girl home wasn't how the house worked, and Osome tried to explain that she'd be punished for insulting an Edo customer if she just left. The stranger, it turned out, didn't fully understand the etiquette of the quarter. He assumed money solved everything. It took some back and forth before they figured out the actual problem. He wasn't even her assigned customer. Neither of them knew who the other was supposed to be for. He solved it his way, simply declared himself her customer on the spot, paid and sent word through the attending maid, Oyuki, that he wanted her fee settled and the girl excused for the night. No complaints, no blame attached to her. Oyuki laughed at the whole arrangement, but delivered it anyway. Osome, ordered back into the banquet room until the party broke up, found the room transformed once she returned to it. The same lanterns, the same noise, but suddenly bearable because now she had a customer whose only demand of her so far had been mercy. She studied him properly for the first time under the light. Young, maybe 20, 21. A sharp, dark-browed face. Quiet. He drank steadily and said very little. When the party ended near midnight, his name still unknown to her, he walked out into the rain alone. Osome and Oyuki saw him to the door. "Come again," Oyuki called after him. "I will," he said. "Don't let them punish her." Osome watched him disappear into the wet dark with a feeling she didn't have a word for yet. Captor 2, the regular. He came back the next night, and the night after that, his name finally surfaces. Kikuchi Hankurō, a retainer in the Shogun's traveling guard. He wasn't alone this time. His usual drinking companion, a loud, easygoing samurai named Sakata Ichinosuke, had a favorite courtesan of his own, a woman named Ohana, and the two men had apparently been making a habit of these visits together. Ichinosuke drank hard and joked louder. Hankurō, by contrast, barely spoke, and Osome noticed, with a mixture of comfort and unease, that he could drink an enormous amount without seeming to enjoy it much. What kept pulling her attention wasn't his silence. It was the fact that he'd come back at all. A man who pays your fee and sends you home isn't obligated to return. Yet here he was, a second night in a row, sitting through Ichinosuke's noise, occasionally glancing her way like he was working something out privately. That night, as the party wound down, Hankurō again tried to leave without staying over, and Osome, working up the nerve, asked Oyuki privately if there was some way to keep him a little longer. It wasn't a professional calculation. She wanted, for reasons she could barely admit to herself, for him to stay. Oyuki, a seasoned hand at exactly this kind of maneuvering, physically hauled the half-resisting Hankurō back into the room and made the arrangement official. He was Osome's customer for the night, whether he'd planned on it or not. Cold rain started sometime after midnight. In the quiet that followed, they finally told each other who they actually were. He was Kikuchi Hankurō, part of the new Shogun's escort. Ichinosuke, Ohana's regular, was one Sakata Ichinosuke. Osome told him her own story in return, a rice merchant's daughter from a family that had gone under. A father and a little sister now scraping by in a back alley tenement, herself sold into the house for 200 pieces of silver to cover the debt. She told him, crying into the bedding, that a courtesan's life meant she had no idea who she'd be serving tomorrow, or the day after. Hankurō listened with a grim face. Then he said something that would define the next month of her life. Fine, understood. Starting tomorrow, I'll keep you booked. Every day, every night. No other customers. He kept his word. From that point on, Osome belonged, for all practical purposes, to one man alone. The house was thrilled. A fresh girl landing an exclusive patron on her debut was rare good fortune. Even Ohana, needling her the way friends do, admitted Hankurō looked like the real thing next to her own scattered, wandering Ichinosuke. For half a month, it felt like a dream nobody was going to wake her from. Then, on a clear night under a waning moon, Hankurō ran into someone on the road who would end that dream for good. Chapter 3. The Price of a Nightingale. The man's name was Genzaburo, Ichinosuke's younger brother, and about as different from him as two brothers could be. Where Ichinosuke drifted from pleasure house to pleasure house without a second thought, Genzaburo was rigid, dutiful, and increasingly furious at his brother's behavior while on official duty in Kyoto. "Looking for my brother," Genzaburo told Hankurō bluntly on the road that night. "His carrying on has gone too far." Hankurō, half out of loyalty to his drinking friend, half without thinking, let slip that he knew exactly where Ichinosuke was and offered to fetch him himself. Genzaburo, sharp enough to read between the lines, realized his brother's friend was cut from the same cloth. A cold contempt settled into how he looked at Hankurō from then on. They parted on the road, Hankurō laughing it off to himself. He's figured us out, while privately insisting to himself that he wasn't like Ichinosuke at all. Ichinosuke chased pleasure wherever he found it. Hankurō told himself he wanted nothing from the pleasure district, except Osome. That distinction was about to cost him everything. The Shogun's court couldn't stay in Kyoto forever, and by late autumn, the departure date was set. Early the following month, the entire retinue would march back to Edo. For Osome, the calendar had become a countdown to her own quiet execution. She watched the withering leaves along the Kamo riverbank the way a prisoner watches a clock. Hankurō, seeing her fade under the weight of it, finally admitted the truth to her directly. He had to return with the Shogun's household. There was no version of events where a retainer simply stayed behind for a courtesan. He urged her as gently as a blunt man could manage to endure, to serve out her contract, go home to her family, live. Osome told him she'd rather die of grief than live through it. Rattled by her despair, Hankurō came up with a plan and took it to the only person he trusted with money, Ichinosuke. He asked to sell his family's heirloom sword, a valuable blade from Sagami province, through a Kyoto dealer Ichinosuke knew in order to raise 200 silver pieces and buy out Osome's contract. He framed it, half joking, as buying a Kyoto Nightingale just to set her free from her cage. Ichinosuke understood the metaphor immediately and refused flatly. He wasn't unsympathetic. He'd spent as much on pleasure district women as any man in Kyoto, but there was a difference, he argued, between enjoying a woman's company for a season and selling an ancestral blade, a mark of a samurai's honor and standing, over a courtesan he claimed to have no lasting attachment to. If Hankurō truly didn't love her, Ichinosuke reasoned, throwing away his sword for her made even less sense. Flowers bloom, birds sing, you enjoy them and move on. A man who ruins himself over something he claims not to love has lost his judgment completely. Hankurō left without the money and without an argument, he could actually win. He knew what people would say if word got out that a shogunal retainer had pawned his family sword over a prostitute. It would follow him for the rest of his career. Reluctantly, he let the idea go. But he couldn't stay away from Osome either. Guilt over failing her only pulled him back to Gion more, not less. The days ticked down. The shogun's departure was fixed for the 10th of the month, and Kyoto's streets filled with departing samurai settling debts, buying souvenirs, saying goodbyes. On the 7th, 3 days before the deadline, Hankurō and Ichinosuke crossed paths again at the tea house, neither one having planned to meet the other there. It would be the last night either of them spent in Gion as free men. Chapter 4. The last night in Kyoto. Ichinosuke had been drinking there since the previous evening and had no intention of stopping. 2-3 more days and Kyoto's just a memory, he told Hankurō when he walked in. Might as well make noise while we can. Hankurō told himself the same thing about Osome. Tonight would be the last time. She'd resolved for his sake to stop crying in front of him and put on a brave face instead. The mood in the room that night was almost festive, full of the house's women gathering around for the Edo men's send-off. It didn't last. A servant arrived with urgent word for Hankurō. The baggage assignments for the march home needed sorting immediately. Tonight, no exceptions. Grumbling, he left Osome at the door with a promise to come back before the night was over. He kept it, but slower than he meant to, dragged down by fatigue, drink, and a nagging refusal to just go to sleep in his own quarters while he still had one more night in the quarter left. He returned to the tea house in the rain. Ichinosuke was still there, still drunk, and by now practically unconscious against Ohana's shoulder. Hankurō took over the conversation with the women, and that's when Gensaburo arrived. Not summoned, not invited, storming into the room with his patience finally completely gone. He'd spent the night handling both brothers' packing duties alone while Ichinosuke drank himself senseless. He'd gone looking for him first at Yanagimachi, found nothing, and finally tracked him down here. Get up, he told his brother, now. Ichinosuke tried to wave him off with a joke. Gensaburo wasn't in a joking mood, and when Ohana tried to smooth things over, he turned his fury on her instead, calling her an insolent whore for daring to speak to him. Ohana, unbothered, needled him right back about being uptight for his age. Gensaburo raised a hand to strike her. That's when the room actually erupted, women scattered trying to defuse it. Ichinosuke, forced to sober up fast, tried to talk his brother down. Gensaburo turned on him next, a furious, humiliating dressing down, delivered in front of the entire room about duty neglected, and a younger brother left to do a grown man's job alone while his older brother rotted in a brothel. It was notably all true, and Ichinosuke, for all his faults, had the decency to look ashamed. He tried to end it quietly, told Gensaburo he'd follow shortly, asked him to go on ahead. Genzaburo refused to leave without him. As the argument dragged on, Ichinosuke finally extricated himself and slipped out with Ohana, and the other women followed, eager to be anywhere else. That left only Hankurō, Osome, and a furious young man still holding a grudge against them both. Chapter 5. Blood on the Kamo Riverbank. Hankurō tried reason first. He told Genzaburo this wasn't the place for a scene, that he'd personally drag Ichinosuke home himself if Genzaburo would just go on ahead and trust him. It was the wrong thing to say. Genzaburo had heard exactly this promise once before, a month earlier on the road when Hankurō swore he'd send Ichinosuke home and then didn't. As far as Genzaburo was concerned, Hankurō wasn't a peacemaker. He was the other half of the problem, the well-mannered enabler who made his brother's dissolution look respectable. "You and your kind," he spat, "have made a fool of my brother. Don't lecture me." Hankurō, trying to keep his temper, argued that tonight was different, Ichinosuke's last night in Kyoto, and dragging him home by force was needlessly cruel. Genzaburo wasn't interested in nuance. He turned to leave and chase his brother down anyway. Osome, terrified of where this was heading, grabbed at his sleeve to stop him. Genzaburo, not even looking to see who touched him, shoved her off hard enough that she stumbled into a serving tray, sending food and drink crashing to the floor. That was the moment it stopped being an argument. Hankuro's temper, a temper he'd kept carefully leashed his entire career, finally snapped. He'd tolerated Genzaburo's insults about himself. Watching him knock down Osome was different. "Enough," he said. "Apologize and this ends here, otherwise I'll throw you out by the collar like a dog." Genzaburo wasn't backing down either. He called Hankurō a disgrace to Edo's samurai, a corrupting influence who deserved no apology, only shame. Hankurō demanded he take it back. Genzaburo repeated it, word for word, twice over, daring him. "You understand what you're saying to a samurai," Hankurō said quietly. "You understand what that requires." "I understand exactly what it requires." Hankurō drew his sword and stood. "No more talk. The riverbank now." Osome threw herself between them, begging them to stop. This was madness, she said, over words spoken in anger. Nothing worth dying for. Genzaburo kicked her aside without a second glance and called Hankurō a coward for hiding behind a woman's pleading. That ended it completely. Both men stormed out toward the Kamo riverbed. Osome, unable to stop them and unable to just watch from a distance, gathered her robes and ran after them barefoot through the wet dark. By the time she caught up, it was already over. Two blades had been flashing in the thin moonlight over the water. She'd arrived just in time to see one shape crumple to the ground and the other stand over it, weapon still raised. It was Hankurō. Genzaburo lay in the shallows, cut across the shoulder and hip, dead or dying, his blood spreading into the current. Hankurō, breathing hard, knelt and drank handfuls of river water with the flat calm of a man whose body had gone into shock even if his mind hadn't caught up yet. When Osome asked for water too, his hands were shaking too badly to carry it to her. He tore a strip from his own undergarment and used it to bring the cold water to her lips instead. Then the weight of what he'd done arrived all at once. A retainer of the Shogun, ordered under threat of serious punishment to behave with restraint while in Kyoto, had spent a month living in the pleasure quarter against direct orders, and had now killed a fellow retainer, a man everyone would recognize as a friend, over what any outside observer would call a drunken squabble in a brothel. There was no reading of the samurai code that came out in his favor. Seppuku and the dissolution of his entire family line were the least of what was coming. "I have to answer for this," he said, mostly to himself. "By my own hand or by his brother's." He walked back toward the tea house to find Ichinosuke. Osome followed, limping on bruised feet into whatever came next. Chapter 6. The Walk to Toribeyama. Ichinosuke was already in bed when Hankurō pushed through the screen, soaked pale, his robes dark with blood at the knee. Ichinosuke didn't need to ask what had happened. One look told him. "Who?" he said, sitting up. "Not Osome?" "No, Genzaburo." The room went silent. Hankurō told him everything. The argument, the insults, the blade drawn over a shove and a dare. Ichinosuke listened with his face draining of color, and when it was over, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Run," he told Hankurō. You and I are old friends. So was Genzaburo to both of us. None of this was planned. It was a bad night that got away from all of us. And if I'd just gone home when he first came to get me, none of it happens. I share the blame for that. Killing you won't bring him back. I'll say, I saw nothing. Get out of Kyoto tonight and don't stop until you're somewhere. No one's looking for you, He dressed quickly and left to deal with his brother's body before anyone else could find it, leaving Hankurō alone with an escape route he had no intention of taking. He'd already made up his mind on the riverbank. Running would mean living the rest of his life as a man who murdered a friend and slipped away from the consequences. That wasn't a version of himself he could accept. If Ichinosuke wouldn't take his revenge, then Hankurō would take the sentence into his own hands. He sat alone under a dim lamp, turned his blade, the same one that had killed Genzaburo, toward himself, and prepared to end it as payment for what he'd done. That was when Osome, who had crept back into the room without his noticing, saw what he was about to do. He told her plainly what was coming, and told her plainly that she had no part in it, that grieving parents and a little sister waiting at home deserved better than a woman who threw her life away for a man already condemned. Go, he told her. Live. She didn't move. She told him what a month of his kindness had actually meant to a girl who'd been sold to a brothel expecting nothing from anyone. That from her very first terrified night, he'd been the only customer she'd ever known, the only future she could picture for herself, however briefly. A courtesan's contract still had years left to run. Without him in it, she said, there was no version of that future she wanted to survive. Hankurō looked at her for a long moment, not as a customer looks at a courtesan, but as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. Not a woman bought for an evening, but someone he might have called his wife in another life where any of this had gone differently. Something settled in him. I understand, he said quietly and helped her to her feet. Don't cry anymore. They didn't leave Genzaburo's body on display, and they didn't try to run from what waited for them. Instead, sometime before dawn, the two of them slipped out of the tea house together and walked toward the one place a fugitive and a dead man's killer could still choose for themselves. Toribeyama, the hillside outside Kyoto, where the city burned and buried its dead. Whatever they were wearing that night has been lost to embellishment. Later ballads dressed Osome in white silk and violet wisteria patterns, and Hankurō in black satin lined with pale indigo, the kind of finery poets like to imagine on doomed lovers. The truth of what they wore walking up that hill was never recorded. Maybe it doesn't matter. 200 years of retellings have agreed on one thing without needing the details. That whatever they wore, they walked up that hill together and neither one walked back down.